Hello, good morning, everybody. I'm so glad you're here. We're all continue to deal with the same kinds of issues that plagued Frances Perkins, aren't we? And we have a lot to learn from her. Because indeed, there was a huge social movement raising awareness of these issues. But what happened at that particular time that made all the difference was one particular individual that had given great thought to this and had come up with a way to try to harness the interest in the social problem and deal with it. Now, like that very interesting and good poem of Chris Llewellyn's, in the aftermath of the Triangle Fire, there were a lot of people passing the buck. And really, within 6 months, the fire was forgotten. There'd been a lot of other fires. At that time, it's estimated there were 1,000 industrial deaths a day in America. So although the 146 was a horrific event and had been witnessed by thousands of people, the human mind is designed to forget horrible tragedies so that we can all move on and face another day. But there was one witness that didn't forget and had decided to use everything that she had learned to try to make sure those kinds of things didn't happen again. Now, Frances Perkins is this woman. She was a young social worker living in New York at the time. The economy had been very bad in New York. Remember the panic of 1907? And a lot of young women like Frances Perkins, young college graduates, about 3% of American women graduated from college then, couldn't find jobs. She'd been working in a series of temp jobs, sort of temporary contract teaching jobs, where she was required to live on campus. Then she got a nonprofit job where she had to raise the money herself. Lots of times she didn't have enough money to eat, so she'd pawn her watch to give herself money for a couple more meals. She never failed to accept a free dinner. And what she'd do is she would go and give talks about workplace problems and pass a hat, and that's how she funded her organization. But she managed to get a scholarship to Columbia. She lived in what we'd call a group house then. It was a settlement house. That's how she lived. Just like a lot of young people starting out in Washington living in group houses, Frances Perkins was living in a group house in New York City. And then luckily, when she finished up, she got a job with the National Consumers League where she could actually be paid and someone else would raise the money. That was a big advantage because now she could work full-time on workplace safety issues, which had become a very big issue to her. She'd been very aware of the strike in 1909. She was very aware of these issues. She'd begun to look at workplace safety issues. And then an incredible thing happened to her, a life-changing event. She was actually a witness of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. I told you she'd been living in a group house. She finally had her first apartment of her own by the time she was 29. She was having tea with a friend nearby in one of those houses facing on Washington Square. There's a row of brownstones facing the Stanford White Arch there. She was right, sitting, having tea. They heard all this clamor and shouting in the streets. She ran out the door. They ran across the plaza there, and she got to the base of the building as the first body hit the ground. She watched the women jump to their deaths. She watched and stayed there as they hauled. The fire was put out pretty quickly. After that, they pulled the bodies out. They dragged them, they laid them out in front of the building. They took them to a makeshift morgue. The families came to identify the bodies. Frances Perkins participated in all this. And that night, she and other social workers got together in New York City and said, how can we stop this from happening again? How do we make this tragedy a teachable moment? She was part of a group that quickly formed to work for better workplace safety. And she rose to the leadership of a group that was a spin-off of this. It was called the Committee on Safety. And she was picked to head that by a Roosevelt, but it was Teddy Roosevelt. And that's one of the really interesting things is, and that needs to be remembered, is that through a lot of the things that happened at that time, it was progressive Republicans who were particularly helpful at making good things happen in the United States. She knew it was not going to be that easy to get the laws changed. She knew that entrenched business interests would fight. She knew that inertia would slow the effort. She knew that politicians would end up being more influenced by business interests than by the public good. But she had begun to devise a strategy. She pulled together allies from across the political spectrum. She got business people involved. The New York State Factory Investigating Commission was created to investigate the causes of the fire, and Frances was their primary investigator. Here's their work. They did 13 volumes. This is what caused fire safety regulations to be passed in America, not the Triangle Fire. The Triangle Fire was the impetus. This kind of work, which you all in this room know how to do, is what got it fixed. In the first year, the commission that was directed behind the scenes by Frances Perkins submitted 15 bills to the legislature, and 8 became law. Smoking in factories was prohibited, and this is important because the guys were smoking in the Triangle building. Regular fire drills became mandatory, and this was a very difficult thing to get passed because some people were so prejudiced against immigrants that they said if you tried to do fire drills, they'll just run around and stampede and hurt each other. Sprinklers were required in buildings over 7 stories high. In the next year, 26 of 28 bills became law, including rules requiring fire escapes, improved building exits, and occupancy limits. Let's look around at Frances's handiwork right in this building. There we have our exit sign. If a fire breaks out, where are we going to go? Occupancy limits, sprinklers. Frances Perkins' work, visible to us right here in this room today. Now, how did she do this? We know how hard it is to get legislation like this passed. Just briefly, she turned to unlikely allies. She got allies from the corrupt Tammany Hall politicians who prospered by graft and corruption. They were kindly in some ways to immigrants, like they'd give out free food baskets, give children free shoes, take them on picnics, but they weren't doing too much about workplace safety. Frances Perkins got those Tammany Hall politicians into the factories to see the conditions themselves. She used the teachable moment of the fire to reach out to them to explain what had happened. She also found business leaders that could speak out on these issues and were willing to. People who were secure enough and who had a good moral conscience who could be drawn into the effort. She found other business leaders who had a financial incentive for helping. And in this case, it was insurance industry executives that didn't want to have to pay for destroyed factory buildings, didn't want to have to pay insurance costs. You could get them to come and testify. She used public hearings. They held public hearings all over the state of New York to illuminate the problems in workplaces everywhere. And as Robin said, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire was not that bad. There were many places where the conditions were much worse. Having hearings all over the state allowed them to discuss it. And they spoke out. They used the power of their names to address these issues in public places. And I've sort of been thinking about that a lot lately because I see how many of us are hiding behind aliases on the internet. When issues come up, we use some fake name to say what our opinion is. And the fact is, we're letting a lot of people dominate the conversation who may not be speaking in their own interest, but may be speaking for paid corporate interests. We have power in our own names, and we should be using them. Well, Frances Perkins made a huge difference. On the basis of what she'd done in New York, she was the keynote speaker at the National Fire Prevention Association in 1913. Fire safety officials came from all over the United States. She urged them to take home the lessons of New York, which they did. Then the movement went global. Now, when factory workers die in a toy factory in China or in a daycare center in Mexico, we all know the questions to ask. How many people were working there? Were there exits? Were doors locked? These are all questions that we all know to ask all over the world. Hundreds of thousands of lives every year are saved because of these regulations. I would like you to raise your hand, Sally. The National Consumers League was employing Frances Perkins at the time she did that. Hundreds of thousands of people in the world are alive because of the National Consumers League. Thank you very much. And thank you, Frances Perkins.